Okay, welcome to Rational Animal. Today we have Ted Wright from Epic Archaeology, and we're going to be talking about biblical archaeology. So, Ted, thanks for joining me today. If you could give us a little bit about your background, about Epic Archaeology, about yourself, and your fascination with archaeology, that'd be awesome.
Well, Matt, it's great to be on with you today, and great to see you again, brother. We go back quite a ways, and your father and yourself have been friends of mine for many years, and your dad and I go rock climbing together when I was in North Carolina. So it's great to be on your podcast, and I think you're doing a great job. Really excited about what's coming down the pipeline for Rational Animal. But my name is Ted Wright, and I am the executive director and founder of epicarchaeology.org, which is a educational website slash ministry in which we explore the relationship between archaeology and the biblical text, and primarily from an apologetic perspective, and try to show how really the apologetic relevance of archaeology and how that fits into the biblical narrative and the case for Christianity. My interest in archaeology, it's a really a kind of a loaded question because it goes all the way back to when I was growing up in Scouts. I was in the Boy Scouts and Cub Scouts before that, and early on in the scouting, I became acquainted with some Civil War battlefields. And one of them in particular that really made an impact on me was a battlefield that I've visited dozens of times now. But it was the battlefield of Shiloh, just about an hour actually east of Memphis, Tennessee, which is where I grew up in that area, and had a big impact on me and really got me to thinking about ancient history and history itself. So that kind of started me down the road for archaeology. I joined the U.S. Air Force and was in the Air Force for duty, and was in the Air Force, was going to get out and probably get my degree in ancient history. And then one Sunday night, I was at my church and asked my pastor to pray with me about what direction I should go in. And we went back to his office, and he ended up giving me a stack of magazines that were Biblical Archaeology Review magazine. So he said, "I think you might be interested in these. I've already read them, and I want you to have them. There's just like 30 or so magazines." And I went home and I went through those, and I thought that's exactly what I want to do. And so got my degree in archaeology and at Mississippi State University at the Cobb Institute of Archaeology. And it was when I was at State that I actually began to, because I actually became a Christian when I was 9 years old, when my mom took me to vacation Bible school. And so I brought my faith with me to the study of archaeology, but because I went to a secular school, the archaeologists were telling me that many of the stories in the biblical record are actually not grounded in history. So I sort of had this crisis of faith as to how do I reconcile what the archaeology says with my own faith. So that really led me to apologetics, which eventually ended up in North Carolina, which is where I met you. And we met at Southern Evangelical Seminary. And that's where I became the graduate assistant to Dr. Norman Geisler, and worked as his grad assistant, and then get my master's degree in Christian apologetics, and began to try to stitch the pieces of together the relationship between the biblical record that we see in Scripture, Old Testament and New Testament, with the archaeological record. So that's the quick version of what epic archaeology is all about.
Awesome, yeah. So you actually got into archaeology first, had an interest in it, saw some difficulties, and that's what kind of prompted you to get into apologetics.
That's right. That's exactly right. Yeah, because I mean, even though I didn't have any philosophical training at the time, I think it's just, I mean, as you and I would agree from Aquinas, it's sort of common sense realism. I didn't want my faith to just be faith. I wanted it to have some kind of like historical grounding to it. Some people will say today, well, it doesn't matter. It's about faith. But I mean, I think that the correct understanding is that faith and reason that complement one another, and that we shouldn't believe something that's not grounded in reality. So when you read about the stories of the Exodus and conquest and King David and all these other stories, you heard these stories your entire life, but to me it made a difference whether or not they actually happened, and I wanted to know the relationship between what the archaeological and historical record says versus what the biblical record says. And so that's really been my life sort of work is to look at that relationship between historical records and archaeological evidence, and what are the distinctions between the two? Where's the crossover? How do they interact? Where do they intersect? And those kinds of questions.
And you've been on some digs, right? You've been out on some
Yeah,
archaeological sites and
yes. In fact, I have served as assistant square supervisor at a place called Kirbet El Makader, which is in the West Bank in Israel, just over the street from a city called Ramallah, which is where people may remember Yasser Arafat years ago, the leader of the PLO. He's actually buried at Ramallah. But Kirbet El Makader, my team, we excavated there. They would have been excavating there for about 17 years, and from what we can understand of the archaeological evidence, we think this is the biblical site of Ai, and excavated with the Associates for Biblical Research, which is where I am currently a professional associate with ABR. And so, yeah, I've been on that. And I'm also currently serving as a team member for an expedition to Eastern Turkey. We're actually undergoing a survey of this area in Eastern Turkey near the ancient mountain called Mount Ararat or Agri Dagh. And so I was there in 2019, and we're looking to go back fairly soon to continue our survey of that area.
yeah, I actually was going to ask you about that. That was was that with Frank Turek as well,
No,
or
no,
is that
Frank.
different?
No, Frank. I think Frank's trip when he went to Iran, and there are
Hmm.
different sites that people think Noah's Ark came to rest on. But we're really doing a survey, and we are the first true archaeological expedition to go to that area to do actual archaeology. We have an international team. We have archaeologists from Turkey, from Israel, from France, and from all over the country and all over the world, really to do this survey. And so we're excited about that. And it's a sort of an untapped region. That's the cool thing about archaeology, is that you discover things that no one had known before, or that at least the knowledge has been lost. And so we are recovering some of this new data that we're hoping is going to shed light on some really amazing questions.
Yeah, cool. Well, I guess one of the things that I'm curious about is the discipline itself, the discipline of archaeology. You're way better at memorizing facts and figures and dates and people. I'm just terrible at that. I'm more of a conceptual guy. So, first, I'm actually just interested in what is archaeology and how do you delineate that from other disciplines that study the past?
That is a fantastic question, Matt, and it's really the best question to start with because so many people are confused. I get questions all the time, and I, when I first got them, I was sort of like I had sort of laughed under my breath. But people mean well when they ask the question. When I tell them I do archaeology, and they're like, "Oh, well, I love dinosaurs." I'm like, "Wait a minute, that's not archaeology. That's paleontology."
Mhm.
I like dinosaurs; they're really cool, but that's not really archaeology. So archaeology is a study of the past by looking at and analyzing artifacts that humans have left behind, past human cultures, past human civilizations. So archaeologists, in a sense, are historians who try to reconstruct the past, but use artifacts to do that. And so that's the sort of the hard definition of what an archaeologist is. And an artifact is anything that's been made or modified by humans. So an artifact can be an arrowhead, it can be a piece of pottery, it can be a wall of a building, it can be even stones that were actually stacked together. There's an old archaeological maxim that three stones together makes a wall. There's actually a book by Eric Klein at George Washington University. It's the story of archaeology. But so an artifact, anything that's made or modified by human. Historians, on the other hand, reconstruct the past, or they try to reconstruct the past by using written records. So there is a sort of a technical distinction between history per se and archaeology. Now, that's not to say that there's not crossover between the two disciplines, because historians are keenly interested in what archaeologists find, and archaeologists are also interested in what historians also study as well. And some of the best archaeologists are actually people who are very, very well versed in the languages of the ancient Near East. And some of the languages are only known by just a handful of people around the world. And one of those earliest languages that we find in human civilization is, well, it's not a language, it's actually a text called cuneiform or cuneiform. However, there's different pronunciations, it doesn't matter. It's essentially wedge-shaped writing. and only a handful of people around the world today can actually read cuneiform. And but we have many artifacts from ancient Iraq and also in Iran and other places that are actually written in cuneiform, and these are really the foundations of human civilization. So these texts are critically important. So let me mention one other example of how archaeology and history sort of overlap. And we have what archaeologists call historical inscriptions. And you'll have, say, for example, at the ancient site of Nineveh in Iraq, over 100 years ago now, the site of Nineveh was excavated by the Germans and then the British, and they discovered there's something called the Sennacherib prism. And this is a prism that's actually inscribed with cuneiform, and it has writing on it. So it's an artifact, but also has writing. So that means it's a historical artifact. So here's an artifact that's both of interest to historians and archaeologists. So it turns out, though, the artifact, the Sennacherib prism, there are actually three that we know of. There may be more, but we know that there were three. There were multiple copies made by the Neo-Assyrian king Sennacherib, who was the son of Sargon II, and he lived during the 8th century BC. This is during the time of Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah, and Ahaz and Hezekiah, and essentially confirms what the Old Testament states about the invasion of the Assyrian army into Palestine in the 8th century. It matches identically. In fact, we call this a historical synchronism, in which we have a historical record that actually dovetails perfectly with a biblical story.
Is that what delineates just biblical archaeology from archaeology as such, or maybe Egyptian? Like, yeah, how does that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say, and this is an interesting question too, Matt. The whole question about biblical archaeology and whether or not it is even a discipline. There are some scholars today who would say that it's dead. It's old. It's been around and died, and its demise is celebrated. We don't want to, but there are people today who would call themselves biblical archaeologists because they have an interest in a very broad swath of the ancient Near East, such as Egypt, discoveries in Egypt, discoveries in Iraq, discoveries in Iran, discoveries in Turkey and Anatolia and in Eastern Asia Minor, that all have to do with illuminating the biblical narrative. Several years ago, when I was an undergrad student in archaeology, I became a student member of the of ASOR, and ASOR stands for the American Schools of Oriental Research, which is, I think, based in Johns Hopkins University up in Maryland. But they had a journal at the time, back in the 90s, called, the name of the journal, this was a very prestigious journal of archaeology, not even like, it's not pop level. It's like, this is like a scholarly journal that the top scholars in the world would publish in. And the name of the journal was called Biblical Archaeologist. And so they did a survey. It's like, I literally got the second issue, and they did a survey of all the readers of Biblical Archaeologist. And the editors and the members of ASOR wanted to know whether or not they should change the name of the journal from Biblical Archaeologist to Near Eastern Archaeologist, because they thought that the name did not reflect the goals of the discipline itself, because many people today who would fall under the umbrella of biblical archaeology would be more not really concerned about questions about biblical inerrancy or the biblical text or whatever like that. And that's generally true. It's actually by and large true for a lot of people. But I would say that in the past decade or so, there's been a very keen resurgence in even among secular scholars as to the relationship between the biblical record and the archaeology. And last year, I interviewed Dr. Craig Evans at Houston Baptist University, and he said something really interesting, because I asked him a question about the Gnostic Gospels, and which are very prevalent in the first century, and why is it that we can trust the biblical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and why should we not place any value on the Gnostic Gospels? And he said, I'll tell you why. It's because when archaeologists today, Israeli and anybody else, digging in the Levant, which is that strip of land that we call Israel, they don't look to the Gnostic Gospels. They look to the New Testament to try to verify, to see if what they're digging has any kind of relationship to what they actually see in the ground. And I'll also say, just as a little side note here, Matt, that many discoveries that have been made that actually affirm the some of the words and the text of the New Testament were discovered by people not setting out to actually prove the Bible one way or the other. They were just discovered, and as it turns out, they actually affirm a major figure in the biblical record. And I could give you lots of examples of that. Just off the top of my head, I'll give you two. Just in the past 5 years or so, they actually there was now this discovery was actually excavated in 1968, but it actually was in a warehouse in the Israeli Antiquities Authority, and then a graduate student took that. It was a ring, a signet ring that had a Latin inscription on it. As it turns out, Matt, this was the signet ring of Pontius Pilate.
Wow.
You know, yeah. So this is the second major inscription that was found containing the name of Pilate. The first one was discovered at Caesarea when the Italian archaeologists were excavating an amphitheater, and it also contained the name of Pontius Pilate, and it even had his title. He was the prefect of Judea, which is what the New Testament states that he was. And so, so just right out the gate there's two inscriptions that were discovered by people not setting out to prove the biblical record. So, per se, but it actually does. So, pretty cool stuff.
Yeah, I mean, would you say that the term biblical archaeology is outdated? Is it something that's still useful? Is it something that's still an area in archaeology that people take seriously?
No, I think it's still a very useful term, and I would not have any problem calling myself a biblical archaeologist or saying that that's a legitimate term academically, but you're going to get some chuckling by some areas, some people, some scholars who sort of laugh, but it's because of the interest in the biblical record. And the fact of the matter is, Matt, that archaeology as a discipline has been going on for about a little over 100 years now, and there's been and it's Nelson Gluck said this years ago, and I think it's still true, that no major archaeological discovery has ever contradicted a biblical reference. And in fact, as not me, but as archaeologists have excavated all throughout Israel and in the ancient Near East, each discovery sheds more and more light on the biblical text, and which leads me to a point that I usually make in my classes and that I give to my students, and that the function of archaeology, as it relates to the biblical text, is it can function in one of three ways. It can clarify the text, it can illuminate the text of the Bible, and it can affirm the text. And I'm careful to say affirm the text and not prove the text, because proof, when you talk about proof, that's a sort of a loaded term, philosophical term that has connotations with logic. You talk about logical proofs, and archaeology as a discipline is more inductive, so it's going to yield a probable conclusion and not an absolute. So it's not like a conclusion at the end of a deductive syllogism. It is a cumulative case, and there are some discoveries and some events in the biblical record that are not as attested by archaeology as, say, some other events, and some are very well attested. Some have very little amount of archaeological corroboration, and some just have a few artifacts associated with it. But the track record is incredibly amazing as far as reliability. I mean, in fact, when archaeology started in the turn of the century, the 20th century rather, one of the very first things that was discovered was the entire Hittite civilization by a German archaeologist named Hugo Winkler, who was excavating in Turkey and discovered this site. And it was suggested by a scholar, I think it was a British scholar, or maybe it was American, I can't remember his name. His name is Sayce, I think, Sayce. He suggested that what Winkler actually discovered was the Hittites. The only place the Hittites were mentioned was in the Old Testament. And so because the language, Winkler discovered an archive, a library of this unknown language. It was a pictographic language, sort of like hieroglyphics, but no one even knew what it was. As it turns out, the site that Winkler excavated was a site called Hattusha, which is the capital of the Hittite Empire. Right. He found the entire Hittite. So that was in 1909. and over 100 years ago. And so he discovered the Hittites. And this is at a time in which biblical skepticism was at an all-time high in Europe and America. And so archaeology, biblical archaeology, I would say, was born in a time of skepticism as it related to the biblical record. So I think that as we are today, as you know, Matt, culturally, we are in a time of very high biblical skepticism.
Mhm.
So I think that archaeology is a good. Now, again, some people would say that's the. I know, and I actually have books that where archaeologists say this explicitly, that that's not the function of archaeology. But the fact
I'm
of the
sorry,
matter
that
is,
what's
it
not the
actually
function? They say what's
that
not the function?
to prove the
Oh,
Bible.
okay.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
or to show the biblical records reliable.
Hmm.
In fact, I have a book right behind me on my shelf by Israeli archaeologist Amon Ben Tor, that was my textbook for Old Testament archaeology. It is published by Yale University Press, and he basically says in the foreword that the greatest sin in archaeology is to lay across the discipline of archaeology the role of trying to affirm the biblical text. Now, I would say I would generally agree with that. Yeah, that you should do good science, but when you do good science, what I would say is that when we do good science and we do follow the rules and do good archaeology, then it will affirm, and it has affirmed, what the biblical record states again and again and again. And it's not just, again, people who are, very committed Christians who are saying this. These are archaeologists that are working in the field, and they're like, oh, well, this actually shows the biblical record's reliable. And the first example of that, one of the first scholars to do that was William Ramsey. And he was a Roman historian who studied the works of Luke in the Gospel of Luke in the book of Acts, and was excavating in Asia Minor, and essentially, I think, converted to Christianity because he saw the reliability that Luke was so incredibly reliable. And there's some great books on him, William Ramsey, where he talks about, city after city had been discovered where it's recorded in the book of Acts. So some pretty powerful stuff there, I think.
So, what role does history, written history, play in informing the archaeological enterprise, archaeological pursuits? Like, as you said, you're digging up items, but these items, if they don't have any text on them, aren't self-interpreting, right? Like, so how does history? Actually, I'll just ask kind of a three question in one, if you don't mind.
Sure.
So, one is, how does written history inform it? Two, how does like an evolutionary model of the development of the human race play into archaeological conclusions or inferences? And then finally, how does geology play its role in the archaeological project?
Great questions, Matt. Let's see. We got 2 days to answer that, right? No, just kidding. Those are excellent questions. First, the history question. So the question is, what is the relationship between the historical record, or between history and the archaeological evidence? Let me give you two examples. One would be back in 1912. There was a very famous ship that sailed across the Atlantic Ocean. It was on the maiden voyage and hit an iceberg and sank in just about right under 3 hours. And what was that,
Well,
Matt?
the Titanic, or
Yes. Or
I think I've heard this before. So, yeah, please continue.
yeah. So that boat sank, and there were people who did survive the sinking of the Titanic, and they lived to tell about it. And there was one particular eyewitness, a little girl, 7 years old. Her name was Eva Hart, and her dad woke her up. The boat stopped. The ship stopped during the night. He went outside the hallway to see what was going on. Went out on the deck. The ship had stopped. The ship was taking on water. He took her out of the room, put a life jacket on her, put her and her mom in the lifeboat. Said, "I'm going to meet you. I'll meet you later." He actually perished in the sinking of the Titanic. Well, anyway, Eva Hart writes about when she was rowing away from the boat. Of course, people were trying to get off, and it was just mass mayhem, chaos. And again, she's 7 years old, and what she says in her diary about that night is that when the ship, right as it was beginning to take on water, the bow began to sink under the ocean, and then the stern of the ship stuck up out of the water, and then the whole thing just really snapped in half. It broke the whole ship, like somebody just broke its back, and its ship just sank. So she's an eyewitness to the sinking of the Titanic, and she said the ship broke in half as it went under the water. Well, the ship sank, and now it's 5 miles on the bottom of the ocean floor, or whatever, however deep it is. It's like thousands of feet deep on the bottom of the Atlantic. It's really hard to get to. Now, here we have Eva Hart, but then there were other eyewitnesses at the time who said the ship just sank. So here we have an account. We have eyewitness accounts. We have an event that happened, and it happened over 100 years ago now. And there were eyewitnesses to that event. They wrote historical records in their diaries. And so, what is your relationship? What can archaeology do? What's the one way that we can ascertain whether or not the ship broke in half or not? And the only way to do that is to find the wreck of the Titanic on the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. So in 1987, an oceanographer by the name of Robert Ballard, working with the U.S. Navy, he had actually been doing some work with the U.S. Navy to find two nuclear submarines that had been lost during the Cold War. And so he actually got permission from the U.S. Navy to use some of their naval technology to locate the wreck of the Titanic, and ended up discovering the debris field from the ship based on the last navigational coordinates of where they thought the ship sank. And eventually followed the debris field and found that, lo and behold, the ship was broken in half, and they were separated by nearly a mile apart. So as the bow broke in half, it sort of like was aerodynamic, because the front of the ship is really streamlined, so it just sort of sailed down and went far away. Whereas the stern part, when it took on water, it just went straight down. So by the time he found it, they were separated by a very great distance, and in between the ship was all this debris, all this stuff just literally littered the bottom of the ocean floor. So here's the thing, is that what can archaeology tell us? Archaeology here, in this case, oceanography, affirmed what Eva Hart said. She said the broke in half. And indeed, the archaeology indeed affirmed. Now, again, you cannot believe it if you want to, but it's a historical fact. The ship broke, and we have evidence of it. We can actually go to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, and you can find the wreck of the Titanic. And this archaeology affirmed a detail in an eyewitness account. Here's another interesting thing about that example, Matt, is that even though you had conflicting eyewitness accounts, they both agreed that the ship sank. And that's the detail. So archaeology can affirm historical text. And so I think that's one of the functions of what it can do. And in the case of the New Testament, it claims to have been written by eyewitnesses. In fact, the gospel writers say we were eyewitnesses of Christ's resurrection. They claim to have seen the resurrection, and they're writing about a particular time, a particular space, and a particular geographical area. And in the case of Luke, he's writing the Gospel of Luke, and he's also writing the book of Acts, and he's recording people, places, events. And in fact, Matt, every New Testament city has been discovered. Every major New Testament city has been discovered. Every major Roman official has been discovered through archaeology. So what we have in the New Testament is a reliable historical document that's giving us reliable historical information about the life of Jesus of Nazareth. So it's a very small step then to take the next step to say, well, you know what, if it's giving us reliable historical information about Christ, then maybe I can believe this message that he rose from the dead. Now, as a classical apologist, as you and I have been trained at SES, I personally don't think that archaeology can prove that Jesus rose from the dead, but it can really, really strengthen the case, because God has to exist and miracles have to be possible in order for resurrections to happen. But archaeology can really show us that where we read about this resurrection is in a document that has got incredible historical reliability. There's no book in the ancient world that even comes close to the New Testament with reliability. And in fact, more things every day are being discovered in Israel and the Levant that actually show that the biblical record in the New Testament is super reliable.
Yeah, so actually, this isn't obviously not a reason not to believe, right? Because you still have compelling evidences apart from this. But I'm kind of curious about, because I think Old Testament cities, we don't have all of those, right? Like, we haven't located all of the cities mentioned in the Old Testament. And if that's the case, Why would that be? If you could give us some reasons, because I think that it might be a question for some in terms of, well, we haven't found all of the cities, and it seems like there's a relatively small area in order to find them. What reasons would we have for not being able to find them?
Well, I would sort of challenge that notion a little bit, Matt, to say that we haven't found every city. That's true. Although just off the top of my head, I can't think of any major city in the Old Testament that has not been discovered. In fact, one of the earliest cities in the world is a city called Eridu. It's located in southeastern Iraq, near the mouth of the Persian Gulf, and this is the first true city in the world. It's called Eridu, Eridu. And this is the city that we believe, not just myself, but my colleagues and some of my fellow archaeologists believe that the Tower of Babel was actually located. And we can actually trace this archaeologically. Like, how in the world, how do you know the Tower of Babel took place there? Well, according to the book of Genesis, after the flood, whether or not you think the flood happened or not, but whatever that was, humans settled on the plain of Shinar, which we believe was in the southern part of Iraq. And in this city, archaeologists discovered a city was built on virgin sand. And this city is called Eridu. It actually has multiple names. It goes by the name of Kish, Kish. It also has another name. It's called Babylon as well. There were 7 Babylons in Mesopotamia. The one that Nebuchadnezzar built was much later. So, and also too, when you look at the statements in the text about the Tower of Babel and what God did there, without getting into all the theology behind it and why did God confound the language, but from an archaeological standpoint, what the text seems to be saying is that God came down and was displeased at them building a tower because they wanted to make a name for themselves. So he dispersed the people. They literally confused their language, and they literally scattered. They went to and fro. So is there any archaeological evidence that we can see in Eridu or anywhere else where people disperse? Now, again, it's not trying to just ad hoc, where does this all fit in? But chronologically speaking, it does fit in very, very perfectly with what we see at the Tower of Babel. So let me just give you the thumbnail sketch of Eridu, and then we'll get into some other cities, a couple other cities, because this is the first one. This is the very first city, and one of the most important cities in the book of Genesis is where the Tower of Babel was built. In fact, the Tower of Babel just means the Tower of Confusion. It's not necessarily talking about Babylon. It's talking about the Tower of Confusion. Is literally the kind of the direct translation of that. But in Eridu, at the very earliest layers, as I said, the city was built on virgin sand. And this is right. Okay, so just to tell you how far back this goes, Matt, the city of Eridu, if the dating is correct on the city, I think it's like 5400 BC or so,
Wow.
around maybe 4500. There's different dates on this. But we believe, based on this chronology, woolly mammoths were still roaming in Siberia. They were the last remnants of woolly mammoths roaming in Siberia when the city was built.
Wow.
Okay, so we're talking about really old, the first city in the world, first true city in the world. And there was a base of a ziggurat. This is the first towers ever built. These, now we know that we call them ziggurats, but basically looks like a pyramid. It's a stepped pyramid. And the base of this thing, it was a temple complex, started to be built and was left unfinished, and the site was abandoned. And from that site, archaeologically, we can actually trace the material culture from Eridu all the way through the Near East. So in other words, let me just kind of break this down. How in the world how do you know they went places? Well, because of artifacts. And again, this is like a little candle just to show you, if you have a piece of pottery, archaeologists date sites by pottery. And so obviously pottery styles change over time. And whenever this whole science is called ceramic typology. And so this period in archaeology is called the late Uruk period, Uruk. And there is a particular kind of pottery sequence that is known about by the archaeologists that date to that time frame. And it centers on Eridu and Uruk, specifically on Eridu. And what we see is there are pieces of pottery that are indicative of that time period, that really identify that time period. And one is called a bevel rim bowl. And another one, the two examples I'll give, there are actually multiple things that diagnostics that designate late Uruk. But one is the bevel bowl, and the other one is a large spouted jar. Incidentally, Matt, the large spouted jars, you know what they actually contained or
Hmm.
what they actually held? Beer.
Beer.
The oldest commodity in the world is beer.
I remember hearing that the Sumerians actually there's some clay tablets of them talking about going out and drinking and getting drunk and that
Yep.
kind of thing. Right? Okay.
That's right. That's exactly right. In fact, one of the earliest pictographic signs is the sign for beer, a beer jar. So, anyway, so these two diagnostic, so they literally they disappear from Eridu and they show up. Guess what, Matt? They show up in Turkey. They show up in Iran. They show up in Egypt. And the people who had this material culture, there are people groups living in those. They're not really cities; they're really more villages. All of a sudden, this pottery shows up in these places, and whoever made this pottery is living apart from the people that are in the original locations. So these are segregated communities, which means that the people living there, we can infer from the material remains that they're not speaking the same language. So they're moving in these communities. And in fact, at the Oriental Institute Museum here in Chicago, when I give tours at the OI Museum, we get to the different galleries and I show them in Iraq. They have a pottery sequence display case in which we can actually see very clearly the late Uruk pottery that dates the bevel rim bowls and large spouted jars. Another thing that's indicative of late Uruk is called pictographic writing. This is the proto literate period in which they're literally writing is just pictures of like a head and a mouth and a hand. In Turkey, it ends up being in the Hittite language, which is a pictographic language. In Egypt, it's hieroglyphics. That's where hieroglyphics begins as well. And not only do we see this pictographic writing show up in Turkey and in Egypt and in other places, we also see bevel rim bowls and large spouted jars, and we see all this other material artifacts that indicate that whoever lived at Eridu dispersed out and they began to settle in other locations. So I think this is the best evidence for the late Uruk expansion. It's the best evidence for the Tower of Babel expansion that we read about in Genesis 11, where God confounded the language of the people building a tower. So that city's been discovered. Of course, I mentioned Babylon, built by Nebuchadnezzar. The city of Babylon lay in ruin for millennia, and then back in the 19th century was excavated by a German archaeologist by the name of Robert Koldewey, and then later by the British and the French. All the Europeans had a part in that, but Babylon itself is quite amazing. It's a very very enormous site, and the most exciting thing I think in Babylon was discovered is the something called the processional way. This is the main road leading into the ancient city of Babylon that was actually rebuilt by Nebuchadnezzar II, who was the second ruler of the Neo-Babylonian dynasty, founded by his father right after the Assyrian Empire. And he was a sort of a uh, I mean, he was like he rebuilt because Babylon was already old when Nebuchadnezzar came, into power, and so he wanted to rebuild it to its glory, and he built this amazing gate called the Ishtar Gate, dedicated to the Babylonian god Ishtar. Which, by the way, Matt, the symbol of Ishtar was a lion, and along the processional way there are lions that basically line up the walls going into the main gate of the city. That gate, the Ishtar Gate, was this beautiful blue glazed brick with all these lions and other creatures on it. It was disassembled by the Germans and taken to Germany and reassembled. It is now in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. So if anyone ever goes to the Berlin Museum in Pergamon Museum in Berlin, they will see the Ishtar Gate completely reconstructed in Berlin. And here in Chicago, there are two panels from the processional way that are lions that date to the time of Nebuchadnezzar II. Excuse me. And then also underneath the lions are an actual brick with the name of Nebuchadnezzar actually stamped on it. And this is significant because we read about in the Old Testament that Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were taken off into captivity by the Babylonians. There were two deportations. One was, I think, in 586, 587, and the other one was earlier. And Daniel and his colleagues were actually taken off in the second deportation. So it's very likely that Daniel walked right by these lions and right into the Ishtar Gate, because that's where Nebuchadnezzar would have marched them. He would have paraded them through the streets of Babylon saying, look at these Jewish captives. I captured these. And so that city's been discovered. Nineveh's been discovered. I have a new book I've been reading on Nineveh by a British archaeologist. I got actually right here beside me by Stephanie Dolly. And oops, here we go again. I can never get this right. There we go. It's called Hanging Garden of Babylon by Stephanie Dolly. And it was believed, since we're talking about Nebuchadnezzar, many people have maybe heard the story. Maybe you've watched History Channel, whatever, which you got to be careful about that. But if you've ever heard of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, you may have heard of that,
Yep.
like one of the wonders. What Dally discovered is it actually was never in Babylon. Do you know where it was?
No.
It's in Nineveh. And there was some confusion by ancient Greek writers. They confused Nebuchadnezzar with Sennacherib, that were only separated by about 100 years or so. And so it was a confusion, and the Greeks were really not concerned. They also confused the Tigris and Euphrates rivers when they were referring to it. But both Sennacherib and Nebuchadnezzar both rebuilt their capital, but it was actually in Nineveh by Sennacherib, the same Assyrian ruler that actually attacked Judah and Jerusalem in the 8th century BC. So there was some confusion on that. But the Hanging Gardens were actually in Nineveh, and they were actually written about on the Sennacherib prism, incidentally, the same prism that talks about the invasion of Judah and Jerusalem in the 8th century BC. So there's a lot of cool things where archaeology can actually bring clarification to the text as well as affirmation.
Cool. That's great.
Yeah.
Do I have time for one more? More
Yes,
question?
absolutely. Yeah.
So, okay, this is one of the things I'm interested in, and more recently I've gotten into Dr. Heiser's works on biblical interpretation. He's kind of going back and trying to recover the old world worldview. I think is how he calls it, a worldview, an old school worldview that includes the supernatural. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on maybe how the Akkadians and Sumerians, like archaeological evidence of them and understanding of their religion, may have carried over into the Old Testament. Like Abraham, for example, right, comes from that area, and my guess is that he probably would have carried at least some kind of notions of their religion with him. Is there anything that you would find in history or archaeology that you think those notions of the cosmology were carried over in the patriarchs, for example?
Yeah, that is a great question, Matt, and it's really. I mean, I'll be glad to comment on that. It's really not necessarily an archaeological question, although archaeology does certainly inform it. And I'm actually have an article that I have been working on for a couple of months, and I'm still polishing it. And this is a very, very important question, I think. And I really appreciate the work of Dr. Heiser. I need to read more about his exact views, but so this is a question that has really perplexed people for many years, is the relationship between the biblical writers and their original historical context, the people, the cultures that they lived in, that they came from. And so there are essentially, and I'm going to simplify, because I like to try to simplify things, not only for my audience, but also for myself, that I can sort of take a grasp on this. But when you look at, let's say, the biblical record and the biblical writers, are they, here's, let me just, first let me say this. I would 100% agree with Heiser and Dr. Walton and other scholars who would say that in order to understand the Old Testament, we have to understand the original context of the ancient world. I would absolutely 100% agree with that. That is absolutely true, because it was not written to modern people. It was written to ancient people, and it was written to their world. And in order to understand it, we have to understand the cultures and the context in which they came from. And this is where archaeology can throw light on these cultures,
Right.
and help us to understand their worldview.
Especially the Sumerians and the Akkadians, and when you get that far back, right? I mean,
absolutely. But the question is, okay, so this whole thing, here are two approaches that you can take. These are two basic schools of thought that usually scholars fall under when it comes to questions about what is the relationship between the Sumerians and Akkadians and Abraham? Did Abraham sort of get his ideas from God from them? I've even heard people say that maybe Moses got his idea from God from Amenhotep the fourth, or Akhenaten, who was tried to institute Aten worship in Egypt. That's a whole other question. It has to do with chronology, and the chronology is not right. But in any case, when all the sand settles down, it really comes down to this question, I think, Matt. And I mean, I'd make no apologies about this. I'm an inerrantist. I mean, I fully hold to inerrancy. It's on our website. So where I draw the line in the sand is really that the biblical writers are giving us the truth. They're giving us the truth about reality. But the question is, how do we interpret that? How do we interpret what they actually meant by what they said? So there are two schools of thought on that. And that is that you can look at the comparative approach by comparing what the biblical writers taught about God and the worldview, and also look at what ancient writers, such as the Sumerians or Akkadians or whatever the case may be, such as the Enuma Elish. In the case of the ancient Mesopotamians, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Atrahasis, the myth of Atrahasis, and any other ancient writings that were very influential. But keep in mind, these were written, all these early, in fact, let me go back to say this, that like, for instance, the Epic of Gilgamesh, this was one of the first things that was written down when humans could actually tell stories. Because when writing started, you got the Proto-Literate period, in which basically, I'm going to use a coaster here to give an example here, but basically on this coaster, see here, let's say you have writing, cuneiform writing on it. Okay, well, the original writing was dots and dashes, and they're recording like contracts for like grain and cows and sheep. And then the next thing they write down is astronomical, like they start to look at the stars, because agriculture is very important. And so they're not writing their stories yet. So they're primarily, the ancient world was an oral culture. Whatever stories they had, they're passing down through an oral idea. And when writing starts out, they don't write down stories, they're writing down contracts. They're writing down how to live together in this economic relationship now that they find themselves in these cities, or these proto-cities. But when they do begin to write down the stories, one of the very first stories they write down is the myth of Atrahasis and the Epic of Gilgamesh. And both of these stories contain a flood story about a righteous man who had the gods, or the god, being sad that the world had become corrupt, and sent a flood. And there was a righteous man and his family. God told them to build a boat and put animals on it, and the flood came. This is the very first thing. So there's been a lot of ink spilled on this question. I've got several books on it. We have an article at Epic Archaeology about this called The Epic of Gilgamesh in the Bible. And I have a really good book by a former professor at the University of Chicago on this question about the Epic of Gilgamesh in the Bible. And there are some really interesting parallels between them. And so you can look at what's called contextual studies, and look at how they're alike. Look at how much they're alike. That's what really the primary focus of contextual studies is, by looking at how much the biblical writers are like these other ancient writers. But the whole other side of the coin is missing, and that is, but how are they different? How are the biblical writers different? And this is called polemical studies. And there's a really good book by John Currid called Against the Gods, about polemical theology in the Old Testament. And so that is where I fall into. And again, I'm not against comparative studies, because I think they're very important. But when you get into comparative studies, you come away with notions like, well, the biblical writers are just stealing ideas from these other writers, and there are really no original thoughts, and but what I want to know is, how are they different? And polemical studies emphasizes the fact that the biblical writers are vehemently monotheistic. And when they write about Yahweh, and let me give you an example of what I mean by polemical theology. For example, let me give you a very clear example in this. So for instance, let's take the Canaanite god Baal, or Baal, B-A-A-L, Baal. And Baal was a fertility god. He was an agricultural god of the Canaanites. And back in 1929, in Syria, French archaeologists began to excavating the ancient site of Ugarit and uncovered this entire library. The whole Ugaritic language was discovered, and now there's books you can get on the Ugaritic language, and there's a lot of similarities between Ugarit and Ugaritic words, Canaanite words. In fact, the Canaanite word El is the generic word for God, and the biblical writers in the Old Testament employed the word El, but then also made it distinct that from the Canaanite god El. So let's take the god Baal, and he was supposed to be the god of thunder and lightning. He was the god who rode on the clouds. He rode in on the clouds. So throughout the Old Testament, it talks about Yahweh riding on the clouds and sending lightning and rain and hail. So so one way to look at it is go, well, the biblical writers are obviously, stealing, and they're saying, well, God, our God is the one who rides on the clouds, and our God is the one who sends the lightning. And so their point, though, is to try to say that to make a distinction between Yahweh and the gods of the peoples that they lived around, and to emphasize the fact that God is the true God. And this comes down to really an apologetic question, and that is, do miracles happen? And how do we know that God is the real God? Because you can say that Yahweh is not like these other gods, and they may use the same language that Yahweh is like these other gods, but the way to know that he's the real God is through the miracles. And in the case of Baal, we see this come to a head with Elijah on Mount Carmel when he has 400 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah, the female consort of Baal, gathered together on Mount Carmel, and they were told to pray to Baal, who's supposed to be the god of thunder and lightning, because the thunder and lightning brings the crops, the rain for the crops, but yet Baal does not answer. But yet, when Elijah steps forward to pray, God strikes the sacrifice, the thing burst into flames, and all the prophets were killed. So the point is that biblical writers are trying to make in the polemical theology is that yes, there is some overlay, but what they're trying to emphasize is that God is the true God. These gods have no life. They say that they have power over the rain. They say that they have power over the elements of the earth, but they have no power. It's only the God that's the true God. And in the book of Exodus, in the 10 plagues, each plague corresponded to roughly an Egyptian god or gods. And so I think that's also can be looked at, and the polemical angle as well, and that God is the one who is in control, not the gods of the Nile. They don't control the Nile. Yahweh controls the Nile. It's not the god of cattle, Navis, in ancient Egypt, that controls the cattle and keeps the cattle healthy. It's Yahweh who keeps the cattle healthy. It's not Osiris and Pharaoh who preserves his people and keeps order in Egypt or brings chaos in Egypt. It's Yahweh. So the point of polemical theology is to show that the ancient gods or that Yahweh is radically different than the ancient gods, and that he is the one who is in control and not them. And then one more, and this is something, again, I don't know if this is, I think there's something to it. I think there may be something to it, but a couple of months ago, when I was leading one of my first trips of the summer at the OI, I was actually there under the Babylonian exhibit, in which they had the two lions from the gate of Babylon, and we were talking about Ishtar and about how the symbol, and most of the gods in the ancient world had an animal representative. In Egypt, it was the snake. In Babylon, it was the lion. And there have actually been lion sculptures that were discovered in Babylon, in the ancient ruins of Babylon. And these lion sculptures, again, the lion symbolized the power of Ishtar, the ferocious power of the goddess Ishtar. And the lion was actually standing over the enemy of Babylon with his neck in the mouth of the lion. Isn't it interesting, though, that Daniel is thrown into the lion's den? Why lions? I mean, why couldn't they just have burned him, or why couldn't they just, beheaded him? No, it was lions, because the lion was a symbol of Babylon. And yet he's thrown by Nebuchadnezzar into the lion's den, and the mouth of the lion symbolizes the power and the gods of Babylon. And yet the lions don't touch him, because God is the one who shuts the mouths of the lions.
Yeah, that's cool. And very much like in the 10 plagues, right? In response to the gods of Egypt and that kind of thing. Yeah, that's great.
So, yeah. So that's sort of my that's my take on it. And I think that again, I would encourage people to look at both views. Dr. John Walton has a book on this called the ancient. I think it's called the Ancient Near Eastern Context of the Old Testament. Where is it? It's called Ancient Near Eastern Thought in the Old Testament by John Walton, and the other book is called Against the Gods by John Currid, Currid. And those are two books that sort of will bring some illumination. Is if people are listening to Heiser, this will give them some insights into some of the schools of thought as to the relationship between the ancient Near Eastern world and the biblical writers. The point that I want to make, the point that I would like to say is that I do want to understand how the biblical writers are maybe borrowing or maybe being influenced by the cultures that they're in, but I also want to maintain the biblical narrative in its integrity and also in its uniqueness as presenting the true God of Israel.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much, Ted. I really appreciate you coming on, and I love hearing pretty much anything you talk about. My wife jokes around, and you just ask Ted a question, he just can talk about it, and he knows like a million things about it. So it's appreciate your coming on.
Thank you. It's an honor to be on with you, Matt. Thank you for having me on.